Welcome, everyone. My name is Naomi Nelson, and I'm the director of the Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library. And along with Lou Brown, the director of programs for the Forum for Scholars and Publics, I extend a warm welcome to this first event in the series, Standing by the Side of Freedom. This series of conversations between artists and historians explores the role of art in creating knowledge and narratives about slavery, the Civil War, and freedom struggles in the United States. The series accompanies the exhibition To Stand by the Side of Freedom, Abraham Lincoln and the 19th Century, on view in the Rubenstein Library through May 14th. This exhibit shares rare materials from David Rubenstein's personal collection, bringing together his materials on Abraham Lincoln for the first time. And we'll drop a link in the chat to the digital version of the exhibit if you'd like to take a look, and we welcome you to come in person as well. We are grateful to David Rubenstein for sharing his collections and for his generous sponsorship for the exhibition and for this series of events. Other co-sponsors include the Rubenstein Library, the Forum for Scholars and Publics, Franklin Humanities Institute, African and African American Studies, the Department of History, the Vice Provost for the Arts, and the MFA EDA program. The second event in this series is going to be a conversation between historian William Sturkey and artist Stephen L. Hayes, and that will be on January 19th at noon. And please visit the Forum for Scholars and Publics or the Rubenstein Library websites for more details about that event. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our speakers for today, poet Crystal Simone Smith and historian Adriane Lentz-Smith. Sheila Smith McCoy asserted in the journal Southern Cultures that Crystal Simone Smith is a poet whose work is at once haunting and human, and then adds that her witness, her activism, is necessary reading. Smith is an alumna of the Callaloo Creative Writing Workshop and the Yale Summer Writers Conference, and she's currently an assistant professor of English at St. Augustine's University and the founder and managing editor of Backbone Press Incorporated. The title of this program comes from her poem, Black Mothers and Sons. Adriane Lentz-Smith is associate professor of history and African American studies and teaches courses on Black lives, the Black freedom struggle, and history in fiction and fact. She is especially interested in how African Americans lay claim to the American nation, even as they explore identities that extend beyond geographic boundaries. Through Duke's Keenan Institute for Ethics, she also hosts the discussion series, The Ethics of Now. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lentz-Smith and Ms. Smith, and we look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Naomi, and thank you, Crystal, for joining us, and thank you, audience, for spending your lunch with us. As the chat says, Crystal and I are going to talk. If you have questions as we're talking, put them there under the Q&A button, and we will come to them later in the program, or just whenever they occur to you, put them in. We'll get to them, to as many of them as we can. So, Crystal, to open the conversation, this conversation is structured around slavery and emancipation and its afterlives. The afterlives of both. I see our conversation as unfolding in maybe 3 beats: to talk about slavery, to talk about Reconstruction and its sort of flickering promise, to talk about now and how we live with the legacies of both slavery and the promise of something different. But I thought I'd start with a really open-ended question for you, which is just kind of, what do you think about when you think about slavery?
Wow, that is pretty open-ended.
It's super open-ended, right?
I would love to think that there has been sort of this progression, and in many ways there has been a progression since the ending of slavery in the 13th Amendment. But I think as a community, as a nation, we still have a very segregational view on human life. And that's sort of where we are, right? And until we can sort of reckon with that, slavery is still, right now for me, white and Black relations in this country it's a direct link and a reflection of slavery right now. So we are pretty unhealthy. Our relations are unhealthy right now. So when I think of slavery, I want to, what's the word I'm looking for? I think that we should reckon with it, really. And we have not done that. And until we sort of get our minds around the fact that we've not done that, we're living in sort of this blind existence with each other. It's not really even a coexistence. It's certainly not a civil coexistence. And it's not everybody. I should not say we and with the implication of everybody. It's not everybody, but it's enough of us to keep whatever that legacy is, to keep that sort of going.
To keep messes messy and make more messes.
Yes, to keep the violence going, to keep the disregard for human life and Black life going.
I think of us both as people who reckon with things through words, right? Through language and our communication through language. Will you talk a little bit about, you were a Humanities Unbounded Fellow.
Yes.
Here. And will you talk a little bit here at Duke, will you talk a little bit about what you were doing in that fellowship and what has emerged from it?
Yes. So I am a poet and I became a haiku poet. There's obviously all kinds of genres. And I became a haiku poet because I was part of a writers group that had several Black haiku poets in the writers group. And I came to know very quickly that African-American haiku poets are very rare. Black haiku poets are very rare. It's not that many of us. So it was really niche and interesting, and I was very challenged by it. And I started writing haiku several years ago, and it became sort of this daily practice, which haiku will, where you're in nature and you're just responding to nature and writing these brief sort of moments of awareness that are pretty poignant. Because it's such, you have to sort of create a poem with complete brevity and word economy. So that's why I was challenged about it. But I soon sort of came to the understanding, or at least started to discover, that it was, what's the word I want to say? I was engaging in nature, but not fully in the cultural sense. And so I started to think, why am I writing haiku and I've never camped? I've never camped, or I've never been to the Grand Canyon, never really had a desire to go to the Grand Canyon. And so these things sort of conflicted, and I understood. And as I started to research and I began to read a lot of slave narratives, because I was teaching the slave narrative course at Elon University, I began to understand the implications of nature. And for Black people, the implication is it's sort of collective history of trauma. That's our implication in nature. We view it in a very different way. As white people will see beauty, we are sort of haunted by it. And it is a history of trauma. So that's when I began to sort of write about slavery in the form of haiku, which is a very different approach. It's a very avant-garde approach, because when you write about haiku, or you write haiku, it is about the present and awareness, and you're doing something very different when you're writing about slavery.
It's interesting. It's an avant-garde approach in a form that is centuries and centuries old.
It's ancient. Yes, absolutely. So yeah, so why not, right? Why not write in terms of historical context? So I found the project and the research very interesting, because I was able to write from the archives. Duke has wonderful archives on slavery, and was able to connect with different professors, and it's just been a wonderful experience. And I've written 2 books now. I'm finishing the second one, and the first one is already written.
So you write about nature. I mean, it's interesting that for you, haiku takes you to nature, right? And the contemplation of nature.
Mm-hmm.
You write about nature as a site of terror for Black folks, right? And I think of that kind of, I guess, more kind of, I don't know, like where people are dragged out for violence to be done to them. But in slavery, it's also the case that nature was a site of escape, right? So are there other ways into thinking about landscape and what it offered people? And I guess I asked that question thinking about maroon societies, or thinking about Harriet Tubman, right? Reading the stars to guide people out of.
Well, so Blacks are able to see the harshness in nature sometimes, because there's really sort of this, it intensifies our experience with slavery, being in nature and thinking about those sort of things. But for me, the last talk that I gave, it was basically a presentation that, if I could sum up my research in 3 words, I would call it nature as captivity, because that's what it is. It was for African-American enslaved people, to escape, right? And even the escape in itself was harsh, right? Even trying to get to freedom was harsh. So those are the poems that I was able to compose and sort of give a lens into that escape. But yeah, and I'm finding, again, because history is never history, it's always present, that's sort of where we are now. When you ask me about slavery, how we cannot hold space safely, even now, right? How what happened to Ahmaud Arbery could happen to him in this modern day time, and it still be questioned as to whether he deserved to be basically modern day lynched, right? And so that in itself makes it a quite different experience for African Americans and their connection to nature.
So will you share a poem or two with us that help us think about your thinking?
Okay, great. So yeah, I'll share 2 of the poems that I created several haiku sequences, and it's basically a haiku, but it's several, and it creates a narrative, because I tried to write just short singular haikus, and I didn't feel like there was enough agency given to the voice of the enslaved person, and I really wanted a narrative. I wanted to give a voice to their experience. And so while it's fictional, because we don't know necessarily, based upon reading a one ad of an escaped slave, if the slave was caught, if the slave actually made it to freedom. So it's fictional in that sense, but it does create a pretty vivid picture of what may have taken place during those times. So these poems were written in response to the archive at Cornell University called Freedom on the Move. And those are ads in which the subscriber, meaning the slave master, placed to find his escaped slave. There are thousands of them in this database. Again, wonderful archive material. I love archival material and documents. I think we need to engage more in history. So
I'm not going to argue with you about that.
We do. That would help things greatly. But these were written in response to that. So each ad describes gives the slave's name, describes any injuries or scars that the slave might have, and almost all of them have scars or injuries. Of course, those injuries are to identify them, almost like a modern day tattoo out in the wild. But it also talks about circumstances, where they might be headed, where they're going, gives all kinds of strange details sometimes. A lot of it's to discredit the slave. So Thomas Jefferson actually has an ad that is in that archive base of one of his slaves escaping, a slave named Sandy. And he says in the ad, quote, "He is greatly addicted to drink." Well, of course, we know slaves were not allowed to drink, for the most part, but just to discredit the slave so that that this is a sort of villainous person that you want to capture. So the first one is about a slave named Maria Francis. Morning chores, My downcast face met at every turn. His footsteps, his foul words whispered. Sundown fields, he trod my heels. This new tune. His shadow cast over me, brute tormentor. Overpowered, I shivered with disgust. I turned my face to the North Star, homebound. And I'll read one more of these. This is an enslaved gentleman by the name of Clinton. Cotton near in full bloom, I ran madly, choosing my own death field, the quiet thicket. Days I lay resting, bloodied feet, vultures circling. Light lifts, edge of the pond, a tolerable step. On the move, the blessing of morning fog. So I know those are a little hard to digest, but sort of that is, you know, an idea of what may have occurred, or probably did in many senses occur during slavery. When I think about something being so harsh that you have to escape it, and you know that escape may mean, you know, harsh violence to you or even death, you know, that's.
Or harsh violence to your loved ones.
Yes.
As a retribution where you're going. I mean, those. Interesting, because they, it's not simply that nature is a site of terror or sanctuary, it's just the sort of like the heavy reality that encases and surrounds people, right? It's the canvas on which all of the vicissitudes and the kind of the distant promise of life unfold.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and I've written several of those poems. That will be an entire book called Moonlit Map. And we have a publisher, but I don't want to give any of that information away. But I'm pretty sure that's going to be a book that's in every library. It's going to be with a big house publishing company. And it's going to be listed as adult. Because it is very much adult content, but there's also Tonka, which is another form of Japanese poetry. And that was written in response to another set of archives, which was it was a federally funded program where they actually interviewed enslaved people who were alive, but were much older and could remember slavery and recall some of the incidents that happened in childhood. So yeah, so there's that, and let me think of, I'm thinking of what else this book entails. Oh, and there's Tonka sequences too.
So, for the ignorant, what is Tonka? Like, how is it? What is its form?
So Tonka is
that ignorant is me, by the way. I'm not
No.
assuming anything about anybody else here.
Well, yeah, they're Japanese forms of poetry, but Tonka is a 5-line poem in which, with haiku, you have one line and then 2 lines that sort of weave together, and the juxtaposition creates the poem. And Tonka is a little different. It's 2 lines and 3 lines. And the 3 can be interspersed. The 3 can be first, the 2 can be second, but the 2 come together to sort of create that juxtaposition and that tension to create the story.
So, so some of your writing, this project that came through Humanities Unbounded, is about trying to kind of envision or create a sense of what slavery was and what it was like. But others of your writing are much more about the legacies of it for those of us who live with or within the memory of slavery. And so I'm thinking in your poem collection, Down to Earth, which you say is about, it deals with religion, but there's other things in there, right? To think about how one lives with ghosts is also to think about certain kinds of spirituality. But I was wondering if you would share and talk about either Still Becoming or God in the Form of a Percheron Gelding.
Yeah, so definitely. So, you know, that the first one I'll read, let's see here, is God in the Form of a Percheron Gelding. And this was, as I was a tourist, of course, and I think the back of the blurb written by Amber Flora Thomas says, as tourists, are we tourists in our lives troubled by the history of enslavement? And I hadn't thought about the poem in that context, but she put that in the blurb, and I thought it was very interesting that I'm here, I'm enjoying this sort of city, and it's very beautiful, very magical.
Because you're in Savannah.
I'm in Savannah, Georgia, and it's very beautiful, it's very magical, and I'm stepping away. I'm actually there to enjoy myself and have culinary experiences and so forth. But then there's the history, right? And it's haunting, and it's always there. And so that's, I guess, that sort of engagement with history and awareness that I've had with haiku has been not troublesome. I won't say troublesome, but it sort of made me think. For example, years ago, I did not like to talk about slavery very much. You know, it wasn't taught in our schools. It was always this sort of quiet shame that America had. And it was also shameful to me as an African American. And so I never really talked about it. And as I started this process of writing haiku about slavery, it was much easier to do that with free verse as well. So it sort of started to appear in my free verse as well, because it was there. It's always in the back of our heads. And not talking about it doesn't take away the trauma, doesn't take away, you know, as what's her name, Audre Lorde said, our silence is not going to protect us. So I began to put it in my free verse poems as well. So I'll read this one. We can never escape the weight of history, even in visited places like the port's city's waterfront at sunset, occasioned by magnificent ships that drag tons of cargo into a narrow canal soundlessly. Cargo that 300 years ago might be ancestors to be auctioned in the town's most center point, where a concrete jungle now stands for the rainbow of children who frolic in it. And where I now stand, descendant, free and useless, a tourist drunk on Pinot Grigio by midday, among the bombarders of pointers and cacklers on trolleys. I stand when I spot him halting, his soft clap of the cobblestone, stout, black, uncomplaining in his captivity of bridle and blinders, as we both stand waiting for purpose. So I should say that this book is about, it's a sort of religious exploitation, if you will, my relationship with spirituality and religion and God. And sometimes I see God in animals. And so that's the frame sort of work of that poem.
And it's also seeing a lot of things that you didn't anticipate seeing, right? Seeing the way that the place where you are for leisure, like going and seeing the history that unfolded behind you that allowed you to be there in the first place.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, just the idea of being able to see, I mean, I'm sure if you've been to Savannah or anybody who has, these are I mean, these cargo ships are like tons and tons of, but the canal itself is quite narrow. So you see this huge, magnificent ship coming into this small, narrow, and it comes in silently. I mean, there's no, you would think that there'd be a lot of, water and waves, and it's not, it's just very silent. And that was sort of haunting to me, right? When I think about slave ships and slaves being transported here and what that must have been like. And certainly they came through port cities. So it's not a stretch to imagine that, they came through South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia as well. So yeah, just,
And a sort of unheralded arrival.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, like you're saying, being the benefactor of that and being able to say, well, here I am now, and what am I doing really? I'm like, here, it's the middle of the day, I've had wine, how am I honoring this? Because I didn't feel like I was. But, at the same time, how do you keep that balance,
I mean, you said at some point, I think in a different conversation that we had, that part of your perpetual questioning is, how do we escape the weight of slavery? And my question for you, and I don't know, because I think I'm about to pose an unanswerable question, it's just something that I wrangle with, is who are we once we escape the weight of slavery? What does it mean to escape the weight of it? And maybe it goes back to your earlier comments about shame. And what is it to know this without feeling the shame of it?
Yeah, there is the shame of it, but at the same time, I feel like even right now, like I talked about Black and white relations right now in this country, it's impossible to escape it right now. It's a cycle, and it's sort of repeating. We know, based upon the 13th Amendment and based upon the amount of African Americans, particularly men, who are incarcerated in this country, to be incarcerated is to be, in many ways, back in slavery, right? Where you have no freedoms, where that's all taken from you. And even once you do your, restorative time or whatever you need to do and rehabilitate yourself, that you come out and you still can't live free. You still can't get a job. You still can't get a home, a proper home, or, and so it's not just in the context of police violence. We know that. It's in the education system. It's in the prison system, the penal system. It's in all of that. So I find it completely inescapable. It just has new clothes. It just looks different, right? In many ways. So, but yeah, I don't know who we are. Toni Morrison did pose that question one time to white people. If you lose that, what are you? If you lose your race, what are you? Are you any good? Are you valuable? Are you competitive? What are you? And so I don't know. That's a very good question. I don't know if we could escape that weight, what our identity would look like. As a historian, what do you think about that?
I mean, I don't know what I think about it. I ask the questions, Crystal. I don't answer them. That's for a policy person to do. What do I think? So roundabout answer. I recently was in a conversation with someone who is white, who was asking me questions about sort of the contemporary situation in the United States around racism and legacies of white supremacy. And one of the things that he said is, I have a daughter, she's 4, we are of Norwegian extraction, she is very, very, very blonde, she is very, very white, and that's sort of like, presented to the world. And does she need to feel guilty about the history of race in America? And my response to him was, well, one, no, because guilt is a self-indulgent emotion that reassures the person who feels it that they're a good person. Right? So what is the utility of it? I was like, and 2, it's corrosive. And I think, I'm quoting Craig Werner, who's an English professor at Wisconsin, who was himself quoting, I think, Audre Lorde, who was basically like, white people have guilt and Black people have shame, and neither one is useful or productive. And so I think I would come back to that and say, no, that knowing Like the point of knowing something, the point of confronting something, the point of reckoning with it is not to feel bad about it, right? To feel burdened by it being your people's history, or, you know, guilty because it's the history that your people produce. It's to make sure that you understand how that past made the world we live in now, and to equip you to do your best to make different, better worlds, right? You know history so that you don't carry those histories into the future. And so I don't know that I know what it means to not have the weight of it, but I think what I can imagine is how to do the kind of work that will make the knowledge less weighty, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes absolute sense. Yeah. Absolute. Yeah, yeah, I think it's interesting, and I won't get into this notion of critical race theory because I don't even buy into that particular
Because it's a gross misuse and misapplication of the term.
of the term, absolutely. So, but not wanting to talk about it, not being able to teach it in classrooms, not being able to really reckon with what happened in this country, right? I mean, we talked earlier, or in an earlier conversation, about generational poverty and how this is sort of Black people who are living in a particular space, and that most people want to segregate themselves from, right? It's poverty. This is a direct result, as we know, of slavery, right? So that's how it still permeates. It's still here. It doesn't go anywhere, right? And so for me, I don't know. I think understanding everything that's going on now almost demands you understand what happened then, right? And so, yeah, interesting.
I want to come at this question from a different angle, because you and I are both parents, right? And of children of similar ages, and we, at least I think about the way in which our children have the potential to be forces of nature, but only if they are sort of like able to, or we are able to help them keep the world from battering them about, right? So that sort of like life force is not diluted or diminished. And I was looking at your poem. You have a poem also in Down to Earth, that's like Epworth United Methodist Preschool, that I really liked, because it's not necessarily about the big weight of history in that world, but it also is, right? Because it's a sort of, how do you take this like silent little creature and help him bloom? And I was wondering, can I get you to read that one?
Yeah.
I keep just requesting. I feel like I'm like you're like a radio call-in show.
Well, that's what I do best. I compose poetry and I read it, so I don't mind doing that at all. But yeah, I'll read that one. But I was saying, and at some point maybe I can read Black Mothers and Sons, which is one of the I don't have to read that one, but
this was my transition to that, so you caught me out.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, because then I'll talk. You know what? I'll save that for that point.
And why don't you go straight into it? I mean, they're very different. I mean, they are not unrelated to each other, but tonally different.
Yes. Yes. So I hope you guys can hear me. There's a very loud machine outside of my home.
I can hear you fine. I don't hear that machine.
Great. Okay. Epworth United Methodist Preschool for Sydney. What causes a boy to be camouflaged among others and eerily quiet like a moth is unknown, I was told. So I searched on a budget, and the church doors were open, and I was mistrustful of the dim nave and the empty pews. How could he fly or not fly toward the fire of hell and brimstone, further suppressed and unheard? Though I soon learned how to unquiet a boy was a simple mission of a mom's morning out class with spirited toddlers and 2 veteran teachers who piloted us mothers. Like a night blooming flower, his silent presence ended. A boy became contagious joy, and I, the doubter, discovered the perfect use of a church. So yes, that's very interesting. You know, when I think sometimes about my relationship with, and this will be quick, my relationship that I've had on and off relationship with the idea of God and spirituality and so forth. And I think about Lincoln, who sort of had the same sort of thing. He wasn't a very religious man at all, but there was sort of this moral sensibility to him, right? So, which sort of mattered more, right, than him being a religious person. In the same way, I'm a big fan of James Baldwin. That sort of was his narrative as well, right? So for the poem, Black Mothers and Son, which I'll have to pull up on my computer here, that poem sort of came about through all of I wrote I should actually introduce this. I wrote a collection of erasure blackout poems from Lincoln in the Bardo that was written by George Saunders several years ago. And I was reading that book, Lincoln in the Bardo, researching something else. I was writing another novel or another book about an enslaved woman named Elizabeth Keckley. And as I was reading this book, everything began to unfold in terms of the civil unrest we experienced with Ahmaud Arbery, with George Floyd, with the Black Lives Matter protestation reaching levels that we had never seen before. And I started to create these poems based upon the little passages that were in the book, because if you've ever read George Saunders, you know he's masterful with words. And that poem came about. And so when I wrote my introduction to the book, because that's a book now and it'll be out shortly, it's called Dark Testament, hopefully fall or winter of 2023. But when I wrote my introduction, I talked about that, about Ahmaud Arbery, you know, running, and my son being a distance runner, running through white elite neighborhoods on his own by himself. I talked also about the fact that, Adrian, as you know, I mean, when you are a parent, your children are centered to, they're the centermost part of your thinking, of your being, you know, and their safety and their protection, right? And their well-being. So that poem is probably, of all the poems in that book, my favorite, because it really does, I'm really in that poem. I'm in all the poems, but as a mother and as a wife of African-American men, I'm there. So let me pull that up really quickly.
And you're pulling this out from the Poetry Foundation?
Yeah, so three of the poems are featured on the Poetry Foundation website.
Poets.org.
Yes, if you nope, that's actually poetryfoundation.org.
Oh,
those are two
oh, they're two different ones.
Yeah. So are you ready for me to go?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Black Mothers and Sons. I am waiting to be discovered, head upended, the awful mess. Mother will not be pleased, having come so close to losing everything. Devoutly loving, standing very still among the beautiful things of this world. Dream kicking, rearranged, passing ship-like, while in town a blue day unfolds. Each flower-pierced yard gone positively mad. Okay, I'm sorry, I had to come back to you.
I think of those poems as being tonally different but interrelated, because if the first one is like, what do you say, how do you unquiet a boy? Part of the answer is communal work, right? Communal work and energy and love and sort of like capacity and ability to imagine something, other worlds, bigger worlds, beautiful worlds, right? In that case, in the space of a church. And then what I hear in the second one is this sort of like divestment of others in seeing the humanity of the child before them.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. And there's that, that's a fine balance, I think, as an African-American mother to Black sons, that you do want them confident. You do want them unquieted. You want them to be able to hold space and hold, themselves in the world. But at the same time, there's this fear of, them existing and being targeted for their mere existence, right? And so, yeah, two very different poems. Yeah, it's quite a.
I mean, and so to think back to the theme of our conversation, you want them emancipated, but the danger is that we still live in a world in which the imaginations of what people can be are shaped by and infused with the kind of the ideological work of limiting a sense of someone's humanity that was so much a part of trying to produce a logic of enslavement. And then in the wake of enslavement, retaining that logic of enslavement despite changed circumstances.
Yeah, awareness, and that's the thing about it. Awareness is great because when you're living in freedom, or your supposed freedom, right? All that awareness is wonderful, but at the same time, when you look back in slave times, there was reasons that they were taught not, or they were not allowed to read and write. A slave that could read or write could, forge his own paperwork, right? Or his freedom paperwork. He could communicate with others. He could, not only that, he could influence others, right? With that ability. So so that restriction and it's a lot to think about.
Yeah, and as you're talking, and like the whole time you've been talking, I've been thinking about the work of historian Heather Williams, whose first book, Self-Taught, is about sort of Black people's self-education in enslavement and then immediately in Reconstruction. So this idea that like folks understood what learning meant, they understood the power of reading and writing, and despite whatever restrictions, they made something possible for themselves, right? And then part of their vision of what freedom meant was the capacity to learn and teach one another. And then her other book, Help Me to Find My People, she's using other kinds of ads posted, which are in the immediate sort of wake of slavery and sort of in emancipation, folks who put ads in papers trying to put their families back together after slavery. And in a nice way, both of those are they're not a counterbalance, but they tell you something about the richness of people's living and capacity to make more than what power or the world wants to give them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. One of the Tonka sequences in Moonlit Map was written in response to a gentleman, and it's called Ain't You My Child, but it's written in response to a gentleman who was separated from his mother at a young age, who could recall it so vividly. I mean, I think in that particular collection of stories, it's one of my favorites because it was so vivid, and he was so young, but yet the details were still there and really just sort of crushing. But that Tonka sequence talks about, follows him through the story and talks about the one thing he was fixated on once he was freed was finding his mother. And he went through, everything, every possible whatever scenario, but he actually, as an adult, found his mother, knocked on the door. I mean, she was somewhere in the South. He had migrated at that point to the North, but was able to track her down. And, he knocked on the door and comes in and shakes her hand. And he says, basically, I held her hand too long because I was a stranger to her, but because I held her hand too long, she knew I was her child. And that was her response was, ain't you my child? And she sort of looked in his eyes, and then they both sort of, sobbed and came together. But yeah, stories like that, I mean, you need to tell those stories. They need to be in books. People need to hear that. Slave narratives are basically in archives. They are you at UNC South Dock, or UNC Doc South, rather, I'm sorry, was compiled by a colleague of mine, a writer friend of mine who is an archivist. But all of those stories sort of live in these spaces that are not accessible to us, not really, unless you are researching, unless you want to find them. So for me, writing books like Moonlit Map and Dark Testament and other forms of books about slavery, in the sense, is necessary writing, because it does need a larger audience.
And my perpetual frustration is that unless you want to find them, right? Where it's like, because you're writing, I'm writing, historians are writing, that they are out there, but people only sometimes are people looking for them. So part of the task is to get folks to see the value, and again, I keep coming back to it, but the value in knowing. Speaking of, there's also a value in questioning. So if you have questions, start popping them into the Q&A box here at the bottom of your Zoom panel, and I'll ask them, because I could keep asking questions all day. But if you have questions, I don't want to be the only person. I don't want to hog Crystal if you have questions for her.
And I don't,
What'd you say?
Okay, did we read the Still Becoming?
We didn't read Still Becoming, and I love the Rodney King poem, so I would.
Yeah. So Still Becoming is just, that's a poem really about what still happens, right? We record it now. It's been happening for a long time, but we are able to record things now and make them much more transparent, which is what happened with Rodney King. He was one of the first of those incidents that we actually see. There is a physical evidence of what happened to him, and that violence. And so I was sort of concerned when I wrote this poem about Rodney King. I knew if I was going to write a book about Black Lives Matter that I had to have a Rodney King poem. And so I was concerned with his voice after. We talked about this, his voice after what had happened and his response to what happened to him. We think a lot of times, you hear Rodney King, you hear Ruby Bridges, you hear, slavery that's an American history. That's not a Black history. That's an American history. We didn't enslave ourselves. So his response was very interesting to me, to what happened to him. And that's where this poem, sort of how this poem came about. He was an open book, opened up somewhat wider by sorrow, by all of us, Black and white. It had made him sad. All of us, white and Black, had made him sadder with our sadness. I thought then, as hard as I could, of all I had heard regarding troubles and degradation, and called to mind others I had known and loved, and all of the things they had endured. We are ready, are angry, are capable, are coiled up so tight as to be deadly or holy. Turn us loose, let us at it, let us show you what we can do. So of course that is about Black Lives Matter, because we are responding to these sort of events of violence. So it ends on that note, but really, I mean, what happens when something like that happens, right? that's a Black and white issue. Black and white people are saddened by that. And it doesn't have to be a partisan conversation or discourse, right? It doesn't have to be a left or a right. We're all saddened by what happened.
And we're all worried about the diminishment of humanity that comes from being willing to do violence to some, right? Like this is always my response to people who resist the notion that Black Lives Matter. It's like, be careful, because the moment you're willing to say that some people are worth less, then we're all worth less.
Absolutely.
And do you want to live in that world?
Yeah.
Right? This one's already hard enough.
Exactly. You know, Lincoln, when he was making, I've read quite a bit of Lincoln because, well, Lincoln in the Bardo, but also that's a fictional work. But I've just read in general about him, having to teach African American literature and Civil War and slave narratives and so forth. But, you know, at some point he was in a debate about slavery. And the notion that he, you know, they were using this reasoning really that because Black people were darker, then of course they're enslaved and they are less than and blah, blah, blah. And he basically, his retort was, well, by that notion, anybody that's fairer than you could enslave you and should enslave you, right? So all the shades, right, of people, not just African descent, but all the shades of people. If that is your logic, then anybody can, if your skin is fairer, you can enslave someone. And so that's what it is, this notion of, you know, the separatism to me, and that we've got to stop thinking about human life in this segregational view, right? Based upon socioeconomics and political background and religious and cultural backgrounds. That's not helpful.
So I have a few questions for you. One, you mentioned that you'd researched Elizabeth Keckley. This comes from Janie Morris. You mentioned that you'd researched Elizabeth Keckley. Have you written something about her? And she herself says, I'm a commissioner at the Burwell Historic Site in Hillsborough, North Carolina, where Ms. Keckley was enslaved for about 7 years from 1835 to 1842.
Yes, so I have been to the Burwell School, and the idea of writing a book about Keckley came from a tour that I had at the school. And I also knew a couple of people who were on the board as well. I'm not sure that we've met, but I knew a couple of people on the board, and they suggested that, you know, you should write a picture book or some sort of book about Elizabeth Keckley, since you're a poet and writer, and you're African American, because the ladies that I had met were Caucasian, but doing a wonderful job of preserving that house, that historical house, for the legacy of Elizabeth Keckley. And I said, yeah, you know, I could do that, and had been working toward that. And we had several sort of versions of what we thought would be a good book, because there's not a lot of literature about her, which is very strange, because if you think about the multitude of books on Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Keckley was also in the White House. She was also a confidant of Abraham Lincoln and of Mary Todd, specifically Mary Todd Lincoln, and very much there, very much, I mean, if you read her slave narrative, that glimpse into the Civil War is absolutely amazing to me from her perspective. But the answer is, I want to write a book about Elizabeth Keckley, and I got quite sidetracked once I started writing the Black Lives Matter poems, because reading the Lincoln and the Bardo was research preparation for writing a Keckley book. So I got quite sidetracked with the Black Lives Matter poems, and then I ended up in this fellowship, and I've been writing slavery about haiku about slavery. So I'm returning to Keckley at some point.
I'm going to ask you two questions at once, and if you forget one of them, we'll come back to it. But the first is, how do you identify archives to explore, right? So you'd mentioned some that you'd used. So that's one. It sounds like with the Burwell Historic Site, sometimes you come across something and it becomes a place to ask a question, but I'll let you. And then the other part of this comes from Katie Brophy-Dubois, who says, thank you for this conversation. Crystal, could you recommend historical novels that depict slave narratives or history books that you particularly like? So archives and fiction and or history books. So the input and the output.
Okay, so yeah, like I said, my engagement with archives or artifacts, and it's artifacts too. So you can write, ekphrastic poems to paintings and sculptures that somehow, slave relics really. So I respond to a lot of various things, but archives, yeah. I identified the archives at Duke because the Rubenstein has a wonderful collection. There's no other way to, yes, that's how that happened. But then you could go to Yale, and there's a number of different places that hold wonderful archived selections. You can easily Google that and find that online as to which places do. I didn't find them quite terribly accessible until I became a Duke Fellow, which is interesting because they don't seem, which I love about this Rubenstein exhibit, the one that they have for linking right now, I think it's open to the public, and it will be sort of given this, or at least opportunities for the public to see. A lot of times housed under academic situations, they're not always available unless you yourself are part of that campus and community. So I was lucky in that sense to become a fellow and be able to engage freely with those archives. And the second one is, so there are a lot of historical books about slavery. I think there are a lot of academics who write about slavery. My thing has been a threshold of how much I can take, because you can read them, but it's an emotional journey. And so there's that as well. I mean, I think the Pound of Their Flesh, which is that Dana, what's her name? I can't.
Dana Ramey Berry.
Yes.
Dinah Ramey Berry.
Yes. So yeah.
Dana
So
Ramey.
the Pounds for Their Flesh, or the Pound for Their Flesh, is one of the ones I recommend. It's one of my favorite because it sort of addresses the commerce of slavery, and seeing sort of slaves as obviously not humans, but literally how they were viewed as they didn't. I don't think they used humane names to even describe them. But and also what happened to the slave afterwards, or after the slave died, and how there were science experiments in which their bodies were sold to various researchers and institutions. And it's an interesting read. It's a hard read, but it's an interesting read.
I'll just add that I've always been struck that Rubenstein is the most welcoming special collections of its caliber that I've ever encountered, right? There's a sense that people want you there in a way that as a lowly undergraduate, I did not feel about the special collections libraries that I tried to move through all of the time to do thesis research. But then also, if I were going to recommend a book right now, I am really feeling Taya Miles's All That She Carried. I don't know if you've read this one, but it's a book about Ashley Sack, an artifact that sits in a museum that sort of was passed down from generation of mother to daughter, with the kind of like sort of tokens of love and memory placed in it, so that as folks were moved, the next person wouldn't forget that she had belonged to someone and had been loved. And it's really gorgeous.
This is a slave relic, though. This is something that they had that was handed down from slavery.
Yes, like a woman's daughter was being sold away, and she gave her this sack.
Yeah.
And the daughter held on to it and was able to give it to her daughters. So there's this.
I did write an interesting haiku in the fellowship when I went to the Slave Mart in South Carolina, in Charleston, and there was a picture of an enslaved woman, and she was holding a locket, and the picture is of her holding it, and you just sort of wonder what's in that locket. How did she come about it? But she wants you to know in that picture that locket is extremely important to her history, to her story. And you do get this sense that it's going to be handed down. So yeah, very important.
Yeah.
Artifacts and are very important.
Yeah. And this might be actually sort of like where we wind down, because we've reached 1 p.m. But I think like winding down with an image of someone holding on to something that is, I am more than just what has happened to me. I'm what my people have given to me and what we've produced, seems like a really nice place to close out this conversation. So Crystal, thank you. Thank you for your art. Thank you for your generosity and conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks everybody. Come back for the next conversation in, did we say January? I will assume that it is in the chat. And that's all. Have a great rest of today. Bye. January 19th. Come back on January 19th for Stephen Hayes and William Sturkey. All righty. Bye.